The Blueprint for Black Power, Chapter 1, Coercion as Power. The instrumental use of force, or the threatened use of force by the power holder to attain the compliance of another, is often referred to as coercion. Coercion is therefore a form of power. It is of the utmost importance to note, as did Wrong, that, quote, a coercer may succeed without possessing either the capability or the intention of using force, so long as the power subject believes he possesses both, end quote. That is, the coercive power of the power holder may rest significantly less or not at all on his actual capacity to harm the subject, but may rest more or less completely on the subordinate subject's belief that the power holder can do so. This perspective, commonly referred to as, quote, bluffing, end quote, allows us to recognize the fact that in many instances, power holders exercise power over their subjects because of the subject's misperception and misunderstanding or false beliefs about the power holder's ability to restrict their options or possibilities. Wartenberg refers to this situation as the Oz phenomenon, quote, for it shows that agents are able to coerce other agents by acting upon their beliefs rather than by controlling their action environment directly, end quote. He further contends, quote, that coercive power relations can be brought into existence by means of the subordinate agent's false understandings about the ability of the dominant agent to harm him. This is an important source of power for a dominant agent so long as her ability to realize her threats is not questioned, end quote. While the ability of the dominant agent to coerce the subordinate subject may rest heavily on the subject's exaggerated misperception of the dominant agent's actual capacity to do him harm, equally and often of greater importance, the ability of the dominant agent to coerce the subject may rest on the subject's misperception and underestimation of his own capacity to successfully thwart the coercive or punitive actions of the dominant agent. The often anemic self-concept of subordinate persons in groups, their low self-esteem, their ignorance of their actual strengths, are more the causes of their subordination than is the actual strength of their oppressors. The long history of white American domination of black Americans, which has been enforced and reinforced by the use of physical force and violence, psychic violence, and coercive power, has in effect convinced the majority of blacks that whites are invincible. Moreover, this history has undermined the self-confidence of most blacks, narrowed their vision of their possibilities and power, restricted their aspiration to the narrow confines of racial accommodations and assimilations, to being the paternalistic recipients of white sympathy, rather than expanding their aspirations to include the overcoming of white power and achieving full, unfettered self-liberation. The unending maintenance of this self-defeating state of mind in blacks is the fundamental objective of white power and the keystone upon which the infrastructural facade of white power rests. We're not arguing here that white power is purely delusional or does not contain truly lethal actualities. However, we are arguing that if black Americans and Africans the world over do not permit themselves to be, quote, psyched out, unquote, by white racist propaganda, if they both recognize and actualize their potential to neutralize white power in either its imagined or actual forms, they can, by these means, neutralize it. The productivity of coercion. We can recall from our prior discussion that the use of force is essentially socially negative, expensive, and prone to provoke overt resistance to its application by those subjected to it. We also intimated that force is essentially restrictive and preventative in character, more effective in obstructing people's behavior than in causing them to behave in certain productive ways, from the power holder's point of view. Coercion, in contrast to the use of raw force, permits the power holder to benefit more readily from the subordinate subject's actions and reactions. According to Wartenberg, quote, unlike force, coercive power actually functions by getting an agent to do something. The logic of the threat is precisely its positing an action that an agent is able to forestall by acting in an appropriate manner. End quote. For Wartenberg, coercive power is productive in that 1, it produces action on the part of the subordinate subject, and 2, because the actions of the subordinate subject elicited by coercive threat may actually produce something of value or of benefit to the coercive power holder. The scope of coercive power, particularly in its political and institutional forms, is, as argues Wrong, quote, at least in the short run, undoubtedly the most effective form of power in extensiveness, comprehensiveness, and intensity, end quote. However, despite its efficiency and productivity relative to force, the exercise of coercive power, like the exercise of force, may be expensive, socially and politically costly, and provokes resistance from those subjected to its application. Because the subjects of coercive power are aware of its application against them and realize that freedom to act has been threatened or restricted, they resent such an imposition and may attempt to break or thwart the power holder's coercive power over them. The use of coercive power as its chief means of control often means that the dominant group must maintain constant surveillance and must constantly keep itself fully informed as to the thoughts, attitudes, and activities of its subjects. Consequently, to the cost of acquiring and maintaining the means of production, if they are an owning class, the cost of procuring, maintaining, and deploying the means of force and violence must be added the cost of information gathering and espionage operations. The relative inefficiency, counterproductivity, and costliness of exercising force and coercive power as the primary means for dominating other groups serve to motivate power-holding groups to develop other more effective but less obvious or intrusive ways of exercising coercive force and power so as to reduce, if not eliminate altogether, the reactive resentment and resistance of their subordinate subjects. This end is accomplished when power holders discover and utilize ways and means of obscuring or hiding the use of coercion by inducing misperceptions and misunderstandings among their subjects about whether they are actually being coerced, Wartenberg, or are being subjected to a, quote, power play, end quote. The other forms of power we shall discuss below have in good part been developed and are utilized to obscure the actual nature of the coercive power relationship between power holders and their subjects. However, we should note at this juncture that the ability of the power holders to obscure their coercive and exploitative actions from their subjects will be critically successful to the degree that their subjects have not developed and utilized their own analytical, critical, perceptive, and creative capacities to see through and subvert the hidden coercive machinations and intentions of their oppressors.